Welcome to Ladies of Another View on Back, and I'm joined today with April and Carmen. And we do have a guest in studio today, Steve Van Dyke, who is the Vice President of Communications with the Lignite Energy Council. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for joining us. I know that we're going to have you on more than just today because the questions we have for you just are never ending. We were talking about before the show started. So let's get started with what exactly is lignite coal?
Okay. Well, lignite is the type of coal that we have in North Dakota, and at the current rate of about 30 million tons per year, we have enough economically recoverable reserves to last 800 years. So we have a lot of lignite. We're the second largest known reserve of lignite in the world, the largest being Australia, which is not just a country, but it's also a continent. So in a word, we have a lot of lignite.
So what makes lignite different from coal in other states or other countries?
Well, I grew up in Roundup, Montana, where we had bituminous coal. And then if you get around the Powder River Basin of Gillette and that sort of thing, they have subbituminous coal. And that's the kind of coal that you generally see on the railroads. Lignite coal has a couple of attributes that make it different. One of them is it has a higher moisture content. So you don't really want to ship it anywhere by train because of the moisture. So instead what we do in North Dakota is we have power plants adjacent to the mines. And so that's one thing that makes it different. You might see 25, 30 coal trains a day. They do not carry North Dakota lignite. They carry subbituminous or even bituminous. There's a coal mine between my hometown of Roundup and Billings, Montana, and that mine's bituminous and it's underground, and that can go as far as Norway. Well, the lignite just goes sometimes just through a conveyor from the mine to the power plant. That's as
Very interesting. I never knew that.
the other thing that lignite has is it's more reactive than other coals, and therefore it's very good for gasification. So that's
what
why.
does that mean? What does reactive mean?
Well, if you took a chunk of lignite and you stuck it on this table for a couple of days or maybe even a couple of weeks, you'd start to see it flake off.
Okay.
Because it's losing its moisture, which kind of holds it together. And again, because of that, we have the Great Plains Synfuels plant in North Dakota because it's easier to gasify than other categories of coal, such again as subbituminous, bituminous, and then there's also some anthracite out when you get out to Pennsylvania. So when you hear the four categories, and actually there's a fifth. The fifth one is peat, but it would be anthracite, bituminous, subbituminous, lignite, and then peat, which obviously we don't mine in North Dakota, but there are places where they do mine peat, like Germany.
So when you talk about gasification, are you talking for home heating type gasification? Are you talking for vehicles? What are you saying?
Well, the Great Plains Synfuels plant has gasifiers that basically turn lignite into synthetic natural gas, and it also can turn lignite into fertilizers. In fact, there are 3 fertilizers that are made at the Great Plains Synfuels plant, and they basically supply fertilizer to this region for the farmers in this region. So, it's kind of an interesting thing. How do you break down those carbon molecules to reform them in something else, whether that's natural gas or fertilizers or whatever. Otherwise, a lot of the fertilizers are actually made from natural gas. And as you've probably been reading, prices of natural gas are going up this winter. So it's very stable with coal because basically we have so much of it that the mines have signed long-term contracts with the power plants and the Great Plains Synfuels plant. So a much more stable setup here in North Dakota.
And is it 57% of our electricity here is coal-fired?
Yeah, that's throughout the state. So, different utilities may have different mixes. Basin Electric might be different than MDU, or Otter Tail also serves, XL serves some of the customers. But when you look at the state as a whole, 50% of the electricity comes from the lignite-based power plants in the state.
Steve, you sent me some photos, and I want to go through those with you
Sure.
now. Tell me what we're seeing here.
Okay, this is the Young Station at Center, and it has a lake next to it, or a reservoir, and it's called Nelson Lake. And what's interesting to me is Nelson was an accountant for Minn Kota, and it's like, how many accountants is anything named after? The only thing that comes to my mind is Nelson Lake, but that's a 2-unit power plant. Minn Kota operates it. Minn Kota is headquartered in Grand Forks, and they serve electric cooperatives in the eastern part of North Dakota and northern Minnesota. So a lot of the power is shipped out of state.
And the lake is fairly warm. I've been there with kids before, and that's because of the power plant, right?
There were a couple of guys that worked for MDU years ago, and they made it a goal that they were going to water ski every month of the year in North Dakota. So the winter months, then they went up there. Summer months they could, water ski anywhere,
Right.
the Missouri River, whatever. But they had to go to Nelson Lake in the wintertime for the open water.
Yeah, now a lot of people are going to be going to Nelson Lake for that warm water. Well, let's look at a couple more pictures quickly.
Sure.
Okay, tell me what this is.
Well, this is a drag line, and a lot of people mistake the drag line for something that actually mines the coal. So in the mining process, you first remove the topsoil and then the subsoil, and these are components of the soil that have the most organic material in it. And then there's a layer of what's just called clay. In the industry, it's called overburden, but it's what lies on top of the coal seams. And then you have front-end loaders or coal shovels or whatever that actually remove the coal and put it into trucks or whatever to get the coal to the power plants. But the drag line is that big piece of equipment, and it's so big that you could, if you took out the equipment in the back of it, you could have a basketball court with bleachers around it.
Wow.
Actually. So it's a big piece of machine.
I
They
used
have
to
an
do,
elevator to ride up to get into the seat to drive it,
You gotta walk up the steps.
and there's a lot of them.
I've been on a drag line before because I used to be the field trip coordinator for our homeschool group, and it's like being on a Disneyland ride. I think it's like,
Right.
wow, this is so cool. And I noticed you had lights on one of the drag lines so that you work at night.
Yeah, 24/7.
Wow.
Generally, the only day that they get off is like Christmas.
Oh my
Awesome.
goodness.
Yeah.
well, at least they get that day off.
Yeah.
I think
But
they should get a few more
they
off,
run
but-
shifts.
Yeah, okay.
Somebody is not working there 24
Well,
hours
sure.
a day.
Oh,
but
great.
Yeah, glad to hear that. So
Yeah.
we're going to talk more about coal when we come back after this with Ladies of Another View on Back. Welcome back to Ladies of Another View on Back, and we are once again joined with Steve Van Dyke, who is the Vice President of Communications with the Lignite Energy Council. And we were talking about coal being used, how different the North Dakota coal is from other states. And speaking of comparing us with other states, how do we use energy different than Texas? Because everyone knows what happened to Texas last winter, where some people froze to death.
Before I get into answering your question, I have kind of a little funny story. One time I was checking into a hotel or a motel down in the Twin Cities area, and I told him I worked for the Lignite Energy Council, and the guy looked up at me and said, "Late night?" And it's like, that would be
night
something
energy, huh?
completely different, Late Night Energy Council. So
Yeah.
Anyway, just a little laugh. So how are we different from Texas? Well, in a couple of ways. One, Texas is kind of unregulated. So you can buy your electricity from whomever you want to. Well, when you can't do that in North Dakota because there are service territories, and those are set by the Public Service Commission. So where I live in Mandan, which is kind of in the heart of Mandan, I am served by MDU. But if I lived on the outskirts of Mandan, I might be served by Grand Sioux. But they don't cross each other. But in Texas, they can, which is kind of like the power companies then want to have the least cost electricity that they can. And in North Dakota, it's a different setup where the Public Service Commission sets the rates based upon how much money you have invested in generation, transmission, and distribution facilities, and then on top of that is of what the utilities would say is a very small increment of profit. So Texas is different in that way. Texas is also different because policymakers, both nationally and at the state level, have really been trying to incentivize utilities to use wind and solar, which are not dispatchable sources of electricity. Basically, you have natural gas, you have coal, or you have hydro, perhaps nuclear. Those are dispatchable sources. And so the thing that went wrong in Texas was it got very cold. The natural gas plants that were supposed to back up the solar and wind, they kind of froze. And unfortunately, because of that, there were 700 people that froze in Texas. So it was not a good situation at all. And it rippled all the way up to North Dakota. If you were a customer that got their electricity from the Western Area Power Administration, which is part of the Southwest Power Grid, you had some rolling blackouts. They didn't last forever. They didn't last for days, but they may have lasted 45 minutes or an hour or something. And but if you were on like MDU, XL Energy, Otter Tail, they belong to a different power grid. It's called MISO, Midwest Independent Power System, and we had none. And part of the reason we had none is we have more base load or dispatchable power sources than the Southwest Power Grid. And so I guess I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but I hope that explains why we're different than Texas.
So
Okay.
what about when you talk base load and when we think about what's going on nationally at the federal level with energy and everything, what happens if what we're hearing does happen where they get their way and they want to shut down coal because they think we're just horrible, except we get 100% from the American Lung Association and for clean air. What happens when that base load goes away? What happens to the price of energy for our homes?
Well, the price of energy goes up when utilities start making larger and larger investments. So basically the power plants in North Dakota were built in, the bigger ones were built in the 80s. So the price of electricity has really been stable until the utilities, I guess because of pressures by environmentalists, were urged to build solar and wind. And as soon as they do that, then their rate is going to go up because they have to capture the investment that they made in that. So a lot of people think, well, wind is free, so wind electricity should be free, but it's really not when you consider the investment that the utility has to make, both in the turbines and also in the gathering lines. One turbine might be 1 megawatt, let me tell you, a megawatt is enough electricity for 800 homes, or maybe 2 megawatts, but that's really as big as they are. Where our power plants, kind of are 700 to 800. Coal Creek is 1,100 megawatts. So they're much bigger, and there's a much smaller footprint for our power plants than when you're looking at wind as possibly taking it over. But basically, it's just they're not dispatchable. They're intermittent sources of electricity. The solar is good on a sunny summer day. When it snows on it, it's not very good. When the moon starts shining, it's not very good. And while we think that the wind blows all the time in North Dakota, generally what happens is on the days when it's either the hottest or the coldest, wind does not blow, which is when you need the most electricity. And therefore, coal, natural gas, the Garrison Dam, those come into play then to provide dispatchable baseload electricity. I always say, what if you're a hunter and you have your freezer full of deer meat? The last thing you want is the power to go out, because the electricity is basically on intermittent sources. I mean, you want dispatchable resources to keep everything going.
Is that why they're saying that there's going to be rolling blackouts? Have you seen that in the news headlines at all, that America should really be careful because this year we're going to start having rolling blackouts through the winter?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we will here in North Dakota. And again, part of that is that 50% of our electricity comes from coal. But also, there's a certain percentage that comes from the Garrison Dam as well. So those are solid dispatchable sources of baseload power. I think where you're going to see problems again are in states like California and Texas, where they have, made larger investments and also shut down coal plants. And because of that,
They're going to struggle.
yeah, they're going to struggle if they have cold weather, or if they, even in the summertime. I don't think it was this summer, but the summer before, California had problems with brownouts.
Yep.
Because of the heat in the summertime. Well, there's a lot of heat in California.
Right, yeah. So come to beautiful North Dakota, where you can count on our energy, right? And our air conditions work, and so do our furnaces in the winter.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you, Steve, for joining us.